So you're new to testimony and you want some tips. Congrats and welcome to the club. Similar to how many of these videos break down, there's different things to say if you're in clinical work versus if you're in forensic work. So if you're in clinical work and you're looking at your first testimony as a fact witness, that's really different than someone who's starting out as a forensic psychologist and looking at the first of many future testimony experiences. And I'll cover both today. I'm going to start with the clinical. So if you're here only for the forensic tips, feel free to skip ahead. All right, so for you clinical folks, my first advice is to take a big old deep breath. I understand it's terrifying when you don't come to court frequently and that it's this big, scary entity that sounds very serious and formal and vulnerable. And it can certainly be all those things. But most often, it's a bunch of people just like you who are all trying to do their best. And some of them have very little idea what's going on, just like you. And so I just mean that you're almost always not going in with them having read every single word of your therapy notes or having prepped for hours with special consultants who know all the tricks of the psychology trade. It's most like talking to your cousin at Thanksgiving who has questions about what you do that are sometimes on point and sometimes shocking in how little they understand what a therapist does. So the best and most important advice I'll give you is to try and only answer the question that you're asked. If you find yourself talking too long, you probably did it wrong. While one side will typically ask you more open-ended questions and the other more closed-ended questions, in both cases, their questions are going to be fairly narrow and they're not going to require that many sentences in a row from you. So if your response wasn't thorough enough, their job is to ask you another question. So the only pressure you need to put on yourself is to answer the question and no more than the question. Err on the side of shorter. It's much less awkward for them to ask a follow-up question to flush things out more than it is for them to cut you off. And there's also less place to get into traps with shorter questions, and you might hear it coming better in the small percentage of times that it'll occur. So the second piece I can offer for you clinical folks is that if you don't know something, it's perfectly fine to say you don't know or you can't answer that. That's much better than giving a confused or hedging answer that they can later use to make your life harder on cross-examination. But if you say you don't know, if you're able to, it's a really good idea to try and add why you don't know. Like, I don't know because I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't deal with medication. Or I don't know because no therapist can know that. Or I don't know, and because I didn't know, that's why I did X, Y, or Z. The third piece of advice I can offer is that in most cases, cross-examination is not the mean and scary thing you're made to believe it is. In my experience, most lawyers are primarily interested in the truth. And they try to get at that usually with a fairly pointed strategy. And sometimes they may focus on things that have you scratching your head, but it's because their agenda is different than yours. It's not that they can't trick you or intimidate you or impeach you or make you feel defensive. It's just that a lot of times it's an amicable process. They want to use their questions to position themselves to support their arguments, and then you're done. So I know very few people who came in as a fact witness and felt kind of outrageously disrespected or mistreated on cross. It's often just someone mostly asking about the parts of your treatment that on your better days you can also acknowledge that you wonder about too. Those are kind of the most uncomfortable parts. A lot of times it's about talking about the stuff you feel good about too. So that flows into a fourth tip, which is to acknowledge your shortcomings, honestly, like as honestly as possible. If the client hasn't made progress, say it. They already know. If you wondered at times how forthcoming the client was being about symptoms, say it. Being able to show that you considered counter arguments and then why you didn't ultimately conclude or agree with that, it makes you more credible, more believable. And it gives you a chance to explain why, even with that information, you were more compelled by this other thing. But truly, as we wrap up tips here for clinical folks, honestly, I can give you 500 tips, and none of them are going to come close to the main job you have as fact witness, which is anxiety management. Remember that this is your realm. Treatment is your realm, even though court isn't. All you have to do is come in and talk about the work that you did. That's it. It's very doable, and you know so much more about this one thing than anyone else sitting in the courtroom. So you can do this. Now, if you're a forensic psychologist, some of this advice is going to be more nuanced. Whereas you should still only answer the question you're asked, you're going to learn pretty quickly that this is more of a concern on cross. But in direct, because of the open-ended nature of some of the questions, there's a lot more room to wander. So you might get a question that's like, tell me what goes into a typical forensic evaluation. And then you have to decide, what is the 6-sentence elevator pitch on our typical process? And then regardless of whichever side your opinion favors, I've come to learn that answering the question I'm asked exclusively and always can sometimes backfire, when instead there are times I should have offered something more to contextualize the response. So, like, here's an example of that. One of my early growing pains in testimony was in a civil commitment case. And the attorney who my opinion didn't favor, he was asking me a question about a medication side effect. He was trying to make the point that there are logical reasons a respondent might not want to take medication because of side effects. So he asked me something that's like on the list of, a handful of psychiatric responses to medication. But it's the kind of word that maybe I only see once a year, and I have to look up each time I see it to make sure I remember exactly what that is. I don't remember the word. Let's just say it's dystonia. It's not as common as that, but let's just say. So he asked me, Doctor, do you know what dystonia is, right? That was the question. You know what dystonia is, right? And in that moment on the stand, I honestly could not remember exactly what that word meant. It was something I recognized as motor related, but I would have looked it up while report writing, just to be sure. I wasn't prepared to give a Webster's definition of the word when he asked if I knew what it meant. But he asked me a yes or no question. And since the answer wasn't strictly yes in that moment, I felt like the answer was no. So I said no, which was mortifying and something I wanted to take back immediately. And as I've grown more confident on the stand, I've learned that these are opportunities. They're opportunities to notice when my tension starts to rise because of something unsaid, or because I'm starting to try and anticipate how they're going to trap me. Like in this case, I was worried that what he was doing was choosing a somewhat obscure word, trying to get me to say I knew it, and then his next question would be, okay, please define it. And he was actually a nice guy, and I think he just honestly assumed that I'm an encyclopedia for psychiatric words. And he probably barely knew the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and he's sitting at a table looking at a warning label that says this fancy psychiatric word on it. So I think that's where the question came from. I would have been much better served to say, that word is familiar to me as a side effect of neuroleptic medication. Something along those lines. I maybe could have even elaborated to something like, typically when I see a side effect, I look it up to make sure I know exactly what it's referencing because I'm not a psychiatrist. And then maybe I could say something along the lines of, in this moment, I don't remember the specific definition, but I'm familiar with that word as a negative side effect of neuroleptic medication. So depending on where I am and how much leeway I have in the response, some or all of those pieces of information could have worked their way in there as a more accurate way to respond to that question if I had been allowed to give more than a yes or no question. And in that context, I believe I would have been. And even if you think you can't get away with that many words, there's also shorthand ways to do this. Something along the lines of, I don't recall that independently in this moment. Something that's different than just, no, I don't know that word. Because it's not accurate. And I've learned that it's important to explain why I don't remember something, if I can, so that they know that most of us probably couldn't define that word on command, other than that we all have that one colleague who's like an encyclopedia and can rattle all that stuff off the cuff. But I can't, and I couldn't. So all this leads to a tip I'll offer, which is, and I don't recall anybody giving me this tip early on. I think it would have saved me some heartache and some tough lessons. But the tip is that I think it's okay to be a little more directive sometimes, rather than being exactly as deferential as we're taught. And I don't mean, of course, being obstinate or argumentative. Just that I think we have an obligation to ensure that lines of questioning aren't misleading. That we're not so deferential that we're allowing attorneys to misrepresent us. Because then it becomes hard for the court to know the truth. And that's our job, to tell them the truth. So here's an example of that. I was testifying in a competency hearing about a gentleman with dementia. And I had gone to see him in the jail. And in my report, I listed that the interview was approximately 2 hours. And that was totally my bad. Earlier in my work, I used to log the time I left my car to walk into the jail, and then again the time I got back to my car to make sure that I was billing accurately when I invoiced, because that would have been the time for the interview. And then the travel time would have started on either side of both of those. And the mistake there was that I was doing all that without critically examining that the main reason that I list interview length in my reports is not for me and my invoicing, but for the court as part of deciding if my methods were adequate. So I'm much more accurate about this now. But at this time, I wasn't. I put 2 hours in my report. And they kept a log in the jail with my actual, buzzed in time inside the walls of the locked facility. So, not counting the 10-minute walk to and from my car, not counting the bathroom break before leaving, I was actually with the defendant an hour and a half, not 2 hours. So the attorney starts asking me all these pointed questions about how long it takes to check in and how many steps between the, walking into the main door and getting to check in, and then how many steps from the first door to the interview room, and how long I waited for him to be brought in, and can I read the part of my report that says how long the interview was? I read 2 hours. And finally she says, would you be surprised if I told you that the jail log says you were with him for 1.5 hours, not 2? Okay, so I answered the question I was asked, more or less. I said, yes, that surprises me. It sounds like that was inaccurate, and I apologize for the error. So she looks very gleeful, and she starts in on another line of questioning, along the lines of, are you sure that you had enough time with him then? And that's where, earlier in my career, I would have just said, yes, I had enough time with him. But here it was like we were so in the weeds about something that just wasn't relevant. Whether, in this case, it wasn't relevant. Whether I spent an hour and a half or 2, it wasn't in this particular instance. It didn't go toward anything meaningful in terms of an inference or a conclusion. And I didn't want to sound defensive, but I also wanted the court to have facts. So I just said in response, an hour and a half is a very standard amount of time to spend on a competency interview. If there was anything unusual about the time, I would have described or elaborated on it in my report. But having mistakenly added 30 minutes to the interview time has no relevance to my opinion. So was that an overstep? Maybe. It certainly wasn't deferential, and it certainly wasn't the question I was asked. But in that role, my obligation is to the court, and allowing any implication that this particular fact jeopardized the data somehow, because this wasn't a close call case. It was a very clearly established pattern of dementia from multiple sources. So opinions that had nothing to do with that dementia and its functional impact on capacities, that line of questioning was misleading. And I think it was my job to shut it down. Because, first of all, there's only so much someone can do on redirect if I let us talk for a half an hour about this time frame issue. But second, I've waited more times than I could count for an attorney to try and repair something like that on redirect, and it just never comes. So over time, I've really shifted my perspective about this from one of completely deferring to the attorneys and answering exclusively what I'm asked. And if you'll notice, if you listened, this is in complete contrast to what I would recommend a fact witness do. But as experts, we're given this leeway, right? So over time, I've come to believe that my allegiance is to my opinion and to making sure that the court has a clear view of it and why. Because I'll talk all day about the actual holes, the weaknesses, the gray areas. This just flat out wasn't one of them. It was a red herring. They thought they had a gotcha moment, and it was easier for me to just stop that train from leaving the station. And this is related to another tip I have, which is not to trust that the attorney will come back on redirect. If something isn't clear, or I regret that I didn't add something by the next question, like if I didn't take the opportunity to give a full answer, I have built enough confidence now to say, after taking a moment here, I'd like to ask for the opportunity to add to my last response so that there's a complete and accurate version of my perspective. Is that all right? And you got to use this sparingly, like once. You're not going to get a lot of mulligans. But if it's a critical point and you need to come back, come back. And if they say no, then at the very least, it's cue the attorney for redirect. But things move so fast in there sometimes that we're always going to have some regrets about ways we could have said it more clearly or completely or fully. And I've walked away from enough courtrooms with enough regrets. And nowadays, I just try to repair it if I can. And if I can't, then I'm kinder to myself about that now too. Which is a great segue into another tip, which is just to embrace and own your shortcomings. I have a fundamental block with acronyms. I literally can't remember what acronyms stand for. Like the long version of the actual word that the acronym shortens. It's a very specific and weird problem. I used to write out the long version of any test I used, and then I'd bring them up to the stand in my notes. But it was just ridiculous to try to surreptitiously check my notes, and I'd still somehow screw it up anyway. Or worse, I'd have to ask for permission to look at my notes to refresh my recollection about the test name. I just can't remember them. I can only remember the acronym. So I used to have a lot of anxiety about this, and now I just say, I have a really hard time independently remembering what our test acronyms stand for because I usually just refer to them by those acronyms. So in this moment here, I can't remember the exact words that stands for. And now, they might pause. Once or twice they actually laughed at me. I mean, I think it was at me. It probably should have been at me, which is fair, because it's a ridiculous problem to have. But then ultimately they'll just read the test name to me and they'll say, is it that? And I'll say, yep, because my recall memory is intact. It's just that independent recall. I can't do it. I don't know why. And so I've tried to lose the stress about this and just come to trust that if the rest of my testimony is competent and confident, and I remember all the other things, for example, I have a ridiculous memory for numbers. I'll probably remember dates from the individual records that we're talking about and individual scale scores of that test whose name I can't remember. So overall, if I do a decent job, no one will care that I can't remember acronyms. I just try to own it. I can't remember them. It is what it is. There's no perfect expert, and if there was, they'd probably be criticized for being too perfect. So I think those are some of the main tips I can think of if you're new to testimony. Now, there's also a lot of great stuff out there about how to handle hypotheticals and what to do with an objection and who to look at while you're talking and things like that. If you have any specific questions about anything, let me know in the comments, and I can always make another video. In the meantime, this is Streamline Forensics, and we train forward.